think I'm a bit taller than she is. All right. Good evening. To my Muslim friends, I can say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I can say that because my family is Muslim, and that's how I greet them. I'm not being hypocritical or just trying to reach out to you or anything like that. I truly wish the peace and mercy and blessings of God upon you. And to my Christian friends who might be upset that I just said salam, read 1 Corinthians 9. I am honored to be here. I'm so excited to be here and share with you what I have come to find as the truth about God, because the pursuit of God is the noblest endeavor man can ever undertake. And what I'm about to share with you is something that comes deep from within my heart. It comes after long investigation. Of course, growing up, I constantly proclaimed Tawheed. I believed that Allah of the Quran is the one true God. I believed that Trinity was polytheism. I believed that it was false. Say not three, as Surah Al-Ma'idah would tell us. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad, wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. First chapter I ever learned of the Quran, first chapter most of my Muslim friends ever learned. So that's where I started, and I'm here today to share with you the reasons why I now proclaim that God is one in being and three in person, the Holy Trinity. I can't explain to you how excited I am that I get to talk with Dr. Ali. I've been watching him. Actually, the last time I saw him live, I was a Muslim in the audience watching debate, hoping he'd win. That was in 2004. So I can understand how some of you might be feeling right now. He had black hair back then. I think this is more becoming. It's more scholarly. I'm getting there. I got some flecks of wisdom right now. But yeah, so I have been watching him for a long time, and a lot of what he said, even back then, shaped my thought. So you'll see that the way I come up with my beliefs on God, on the Trinity, has a lot to do with his argumentation. So hopefully this will connect, and you'll be able to understand where we're coming from. Hopefully it'll also be a personable debate. This is not about you coming out to watch one debater beat up the other guy. If you want to know who the better debater is, he's sitting right over there. He's been debating for decades. I've been watching him for a long time. But if you're here for the truth, which is what I hope you are here for, then let's work towards that together, because it's the greatest thing we can ever look for. I want to start by sharing with you what I believe from science recalibrated my view of what we can expect about God. You see, it was in a classroom, an organic chemistry classroom, that I realized that the Trinity was possible. And that was because we were beginning to study deeper things about the way the world worked. And I began to realize that there are certain truths about the world that seem apparently inconceivable on face value, but we know that they're true. It's just the way the world is. There are deep truths, and almost mysterious in certain ways, but that's just the way the world is. Stephen Hawking, one of the smartest men in the world, agrees with me. He says this: "It is impossible to imagine a four-dimensional space. I personally find it hard enough to visualize three-dimensional space." That's Stephen Hawking. We take a look at Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. When he talks about energy, he says this: "It is important to realize that in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is." Physicists don't know what energy is, and it's kind of okay. The reason why we can know that there is such a thing as energy is because of its explanatory power. We don't need to be able to answer all these questions to know that energy exists. And if we start imposing these deeper questions, even upon science, we will come up to dead ends. We might not be able to find all the answers. And something that I find interesting is that early Muslims understood this about Tawheed as well. What I want to do next is to cover a little bit of the history and the complexity found in the doctrine of Tawheed. When I was a Muslim, I used to challenge Christians by saying things like, the word Trinity is not found anywhere in the Bible. I'd say things like the doctrine of the Trinity developed over hundreds of years, and that the Trinity is complex, and philosophically and theologically it's hard to grasp. Why would God do that about himself? And because I'd say these things, I would feel I had a case against Christianity. But the reason why that felt strong to me was because I was not consistent in my criticism. If I applied the same critical thoughts to Tawheed, here's what I would have found. The word Tawheed is not found in the Quran. In fact, it's not found anywhere in the Hadith. The concept of Tawheed was continuing to be developed for hundreds of years after Muhammad. That's why it wasn't found in Hadith. And in fact, Tawheed is complex both philosophically and theologically. I want to fast forward a little bit to the first Islamic Inquisition. And you heard me right, it is the first Islamic Inquisition. It's called the Mihna. This Inquisition literally flogged and executed people who disagreed on the issue of Tawheed. In April of 833 AD, the Abbasid Caliph Ma'mun launched this Inquisition, and this is what he says. He has no belief in Tawheed who does not confess that the Quran is created. What is Ma'mun saying? He's saying, look, I hear that there's some people out there who believe that the Quran is eternal. But if you have an eternal Quran next to an eternal Allah, that's two gods. Or that's two persons within the Godhead, whatever you want to call it. That challenges the unity of Tawheed if you believe the Quran's eternal. This Inquisition was launched throughout the Islamic world. If you've heard of the name of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he's the founder of the Hanbali madhab of Islam. He was one of the first people who came under the flogging of this Inquisition. Others were killed. Others were flogged in mosques in their underwear. This kind of stuff happened throughout the Islamic world until 849 AD. What happened then? Mutawakkil said, we're going to stop arguing about this. He didn't say, let's resolve it in this way or that way. He said, we're going to stop arguing about this. Now, why did this happen? It's because there were arguments at that time over Allah's attributes. Some people were beginning to argue, does Allah have hair? Does he have a beard? Some people said, yes, he has curly hair. Some people said, no, he's like a youth without a beard. They're beginning to start talking about Allah, and then they start thinking more about his attributes and saying, does Allah have attributes, or is he those attributes? Does he have knowledge, or is he knowledgeable? And that makes a difference, because if he has something, then is that something separate from him that lasts eternally? These are the kinds of questions that start coming up when you start thinking deeply about God, no matter what monotheistic faith. The deeper you think about God, the more these questions are going to arise. Well, that question specifically came with the attribute of God's speech, called kalam in Islamic history. Is his speech a part of who he is, or is it separate? Now, if you argued that the Quran was separate from Allah, then you had to argue that there was some kind of eternal Quran next to him. Those who were the rationalists argued, no, Allah created the Quran. There's nothing eternal alongside Quran. And that was the Mu'tazili argument. Some of you will have heard that. And that was the argument that Ma'mun espoused. And it wasn't until Mutawakkil came that the Mu'tazili day stopped being had by some of the Muslims. These arguments continue till today, and that's the point I want to get across to you. People are beginning to revive some of these arguments. For example, Nasir Hamid Abu Zaid, a scholar, has argued that the Quran is situated in history. The Wadud laws, those harsh laws that we see being applied by certain Muslims, that is something that belongs in a historical context. It should not be applied today. So he says it's a part of history. And of course, we know that the Quran kind of was a result of history, because we see certain texts, certain apocryphal texts being used by the Quran. For example, when the Quran says that Jesus was able to speak at his birth, it's referring to a Gnostic text written hundreds of years after Jesus. When it says that Jesus was able to create clay birds and give them life, that's found in the infancy gospel of Thomas, a late Gnostic gospel. So the Quran uses late sources on Jesus' life. We know that the Quran is situated within a historical context. Of course, Muslims are now beginning to argue that the text of the Quran also developed over time. These are two Muslim scholars from Turkey who compared the supposed Uthmanic Quran in Turkey and some other Uthmanic Qurans to today's Quran. And their conclusion is those Qurans are very different in some of their details from today's Quran. And they say that that's not from Uthman's time. These are Muslim scholars. So Muslims are continuing to talk about the development of the text of the Quran. And it's not just now. It was originally as well. We saw that even in Muhammad's, the Salaf generation, among the companions, people like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'ab disagreed on the canon of the Quran. These are the people that Muhammad handpicked to teach the Quran to others. One of them would say that the Quran should have 116 chapters. The other would say that the Quran should have 111 chapters. These disputes were resolved in space and time. And that is why some people begin to argue, as Muslim scholars are still arguing today, that the Quran is created. Why do I bring all this up? Because this was the first Islamic Inquisition, and it's still being discussed. Tawheed has not been resolved. The closest anyone came was Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, who said, we don't know how to resolve this. I know the Quran is eternal. I know Allah has these attributes, and I know Tawheed is true. I don't know how to resolve it. The slogan from him became bila kaif. We don't know how. Here's the point I want to make with you tonight. The reason why Islam has taught that the Quran is eternal, while not challenging Tawheed, is we don't know how. Bila kaif. Never been resolved. In fact, one Turkish scholar just put this out of the University of Ankara in October of this past year. He said the argument that the Quran is eternal was borrowed from Christians who believed in the hypostatic union of Jesus and the Father and the two natures of Jesus. In summary, regarding Tawheed, Tawheed is still hotly disputed today. It is philosophically and theologically quite complex. We can't just assume that it's simple. There are many complexities that are involved. There are many questions that remain about Tawheed that are unanswered even today, and the Islamic majority position remains bila kaif. Which leads me to the first question that I would like to ask Dr. Ali. In his criticisms of the Trinity, which we can expect to come shortly, is he also condemning the vast majority of Sunni Islam when they say bila kaif? Is he being consistent, or is he also condemning Islam? That's what I'll be hoping to see from you at your leisure. Let's continue then. Now that we've understood by taking a look at science and recalibrating our expectations, we don't even know what energy is. We cannot expect to know all the details about the creator of energy. Early Muslims understood that. Bila kaif, we don't know. We rely upon revelation. Now that we understand that this is how we should approach God, let's take a look at the evidence for the Trinity. The first thing I want to say is that the Quran says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 116, O Jesus, son of Mary, did you say to the people, take me and my mother as deities beside Allah? This seems to be the verse which talks about the Trinity, and it's saying that there's three gods in the Trinity. Now, Christians take a look at the Trinity of the Quran, and we say, yes, this is blasphemy. This is shirk. What the Quran condemns as shirk is indeed shirk. That's three gods, that's blasphemy. Christians do not believe in three gods. We believe in one God. So I'm going to give you a quick definition of the Trinity. The Trinity is a belief that God is one, only one God, and three in persons. In other words, one being or one what. There's one what. He's God. What I am is a human being. What God is a divine being, God. There's one what. But there are three persons, three whos. A being is that which makes you what you are. A person is that which makes you who you are. So what am I? I'm a human being. Who am I? I'm Nabil. Those are two separate things, what I am and who I am. In the same way, God is one what and three whos. It's not a contradiction. And so this is why when Muslims say 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, how does that work? It's like, no, those are apples and oranges. 1 + 1 + 1 are the persons, one being. And when Christians respond with, no, 1 × 1 × 1 = 1, that doesn't even make any sense. So don't do that. So the question that we now have to ask is, can God come into this world? I want to discover God together. I want to understand who He can be together. The first question I want to ask is, can God, if He so chooses, come into this world? Now, remember what we just talked about with Tawheed. There's a lot of disagreement throughout Islamic history and even today on Tawheed. Let's talk about the Old Testament version of this issue. Let's talk about what the Old Testament says, because that's what Christianity is built on, Judaism. So what does the Old Testament have to say? Can God come into the world? The answer is yes, many times over, yes. God comes in the garden with Adam. Jacob wrestles with God. God calls out from a bush. He shows up as a pillar of fire and cloud. God appears to the elders, Exodus says, and also God walks in front of Moses. There are many examples. These are just the first few books of the Old Testament and what I found in those. So can God come into this world? The answer is, Inna Allaha ala kulli shay'in qadir. God is able to do anything that He wants to do. Can that one God be complex? Now, we're going back to the issue of who God is. Even in Islam, He is very, very complex. We can't understand His nature. Now, within the Old Testament, is that so? The first time we see God introduced in the Old Testament is the very first verse of the Old Testament. The word God is Elohim. Okay, but notice, the word Elohim is plural. technically, we translate this word gods. However, the verse treated that word as if it were singular. So it's plural and singular at the same time from the very first verse of the Old Testament. There are actually 4 examples of this pluriform God in Genesis chapter 1. I can't go into all, but one more that I want to go to is Genesis 1:26. Same chapter, 4 examples. This is the second. It's that God says, "Let us make man in our image." Now you might say, well, that's just majestic talk. God is just being majestic. Gleason Archer has pointed out that never in the Hebrew Bible does that way of using the word us ever get used in a form of majesty. God is saying something about himself. He's plural and yet singular. Now, the most common response to this, and one I've heard Dr. Ali give the most in his talks, is what about the Shema? This is like the Jewish Shahada. This is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Doesn't that say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one"? Well, that's one translation of it. What it can also say is, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone." And in fact, that is one of the Hebrew translations used today, even among Jews. Now note, the word echad is an interesting word. Whenever the Bible wants to talk about something that is one and has multiple components in that one, it uses the word echad. Follow me, this is extremely important. If God wants to say, "I am one and plural," the word he would use is echad. How do we know that? Let's look at these examples. Genesis 1:5 is one example. Let's look at Genesis 2:24. It says, "Man and woman will become one." The word one there is echad. Man, woman, 2 people will become one echad. Numbers 13:23, a single cluster of grapes, many different grapes making one cluster is echad. That's what the word echad means. Now there is a perfectly good word for one and one alone in Hebrew, and that's yechid. For example, in Judges, she was his one and only child, yechid. Jeremiah, mourn as if for an only son, yechid. So if Yahweh wanted to say, "I am one in one alone," he would have used the word yechid. But if he wanted to say, "I am one in plural in my unity," he would use the word echad, and that's exactly what we see him as having used. So we're introduced to a God who can be potentially complex. He refers to himself in the plural. And then we start seeing this. This is fascinating. I want you to watch this very carefully. In Genesis chapter 18, it says that Yahweh appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre near Sodom and Gomorrah. Yahweh appeared. So this is another one of those examples where God appears as a man. Then in verse 19:24, look at this. It says, now here's Yahweh about to rain fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. It says, "Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of heaven." Think about this. Yahweh, who's appeared as a man, is raining fire from Yahweh in heaven. And the Hebrew here actually says Yahweh twice. This isn't a bad translation of the Hebrew. What does this mean? Well, we know the Jews only believe in one God. How can Yahweh be there and here? Now, is this just Nabil's interpretation of the Old Testament? Is this just a weird thing I'm doing with the text? Look at Amos chapter 4, verse 11. "I overthrew you as Elohim overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, declares Yahweh." Even the Old Testament realizes that Yahweh declares that Yahweh overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. There are 2, but we know there's only one God. Take a look at Psalm 110, verse 1. "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand." In that context, sitting at the right hand of God is like ruling the universe with God. And it says, "The Lord said to my Lord." Once again, we see that there's almost as if there are 2 gods, but we know there's only one God. The Old Testament is very clear about that. This is one that I definitely want you to grasp. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Daniel sees the Ancient of Days, who is the Father, God. He sees God. And then he says in verse 13, "I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came even to the Ancient of Days and was brought near before him." Okay, so here's the Ancient of Days, and there's one who looks like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. Deuteronomy 33 tells us only Yahweh comes on the clouds. But here's Son of Man coming on the clouds. So already we should be thinking, wait a minute, these are 2 God figures. And then verse 14 says this, "And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him." Wait a minute. To the Son of Man is given glory, over heaven. That's what it says. And it says the people of every nation and language will serve him. This word serve is used over 130 times in the Bible. Every time it's used is used to denote a service due to God alone. And here it's being given to one who looks like a son of man. So it looks like once again we have God the Father and we have this other kind of divine being who's called one who looks like a son of man. Here's the point I want to make to you. The earliest Christian records proclaim that Yahweh came into this earth. It's something he has done before, and he's going to do it. We're promised he will do it in Isaiah 9:6. This is what Mark's gospel has to say about Jesus. Mark 1, verse 3. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him. Now Isaiah is saying Jesus is coming, prepare the way of the Lord. Look in Isaiah 40, verse 3. Clear the way for Yahweh in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Mark takes the word Yahweh and puts Jesus in that very same context. He's equating Jesus to Yahweh. Mark 2:28 says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Well, the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. When Jesus says he's Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying he's Lord of the 10 commandments. Once again, Mark is giving Jesus a prerogative of Yahweh alone. In Mark 4:38, the disciples were on a boat caught in a storm, and they called out to Jesus in their trouble, and he delivered them and made the storm to be still. Look at Psalm 107. God's people are on a boat caught in a storm, and they called out to Yahweh in their trouble, and he delivered them and made the storm to be still. Mark is taking Yahweh out and putting Jesus in. In Mark 14:62, when Jesus is asked who he is, he gives a trifold response. We're going to focus on the second part. He says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. What does this remind you of? The two verses from the Old Testament where it looked like there are two divine figures. The one sitting at the right hand of the power, co-ruler over the universe, and the one coming on the clouds of heaven, who comes only as God would come, is given only the divine prerogatives of God, and served worship by all people for all time. Jesus says, you remember those passages which had two Yahwehs? One of them is me. And this is why they said, crucify him, because he was claiming to be God. Look, this isn't just found in Mark's gospel. Here's the other point that I want to make to Dr. Shabir Ali. Every single earliest record we have in the New Testament portrays Jesus as Yahweh. The Carmen Christi of Philippians 2 is one of the earliest records we have of Christian history. It's an insight into the time before the New Testament was written, right after Jesus was resurrected. What does it do? In verses 10 and 11, it says, to Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Where do they get that from? Isaiah 45, where it says, to Yahweh, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Even before Mark's gospel, people are taking Yahweh's name and putting it in with Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 8:6, we see Paul, and this is actually pre-Pauline, as Bar Ehrman would argue. He does argue in his new book. The earliest, even before Paul, even before Mark, Christians took the Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, took that and divided that up between two, the Father and the Son. And that's what 1 Corinthians 8:6 is. Why does this matter? I've got just over a minute to explain why all of this matters. The first thing I want to explain to you is that the Trinity is the best explanation for who God is, the best explanation of the biblical data. It's the best explanation of what God has been doing from the time of Adam and Moses and onwards through Jesus. But also I want to say that intimacy with God is the most important, noble pursuit we could ever have. To know that God is a God of true love. Why does this matter? Love is the root of all things we consider good. Look at the names of Allah that we were taught. He is Ar-Rahman, He is Ar-Rahim, He is Al-Wadud. What are these things? They're all relational terms about love, self-sacrifice, graciousness, mercy. What do these things have in common? They all come from love. And the reason why that matters is because according to the Islamic view, the monadic view of Allah, Allah cannot in his essence be love. And why not? Because in eternity past, there was nothing for Allah to love. He could only become loving once he created people, something to love. So his love is contingent upon his creation. He can't in his essence be love. Whereas the Christian God, from eternity past, is loving. within the community of three persons in the Trinity. And it's out of that love that the Father had for the Son that he creates people in the Son's image to populate this world. And he sends us into this world to love this world as the Son loved this world, to be willing even to die for the sake of those who are hurting and suffering. That is what the Christian message is. Love is at the heart of mankind, and it's because we've been made in the image of a triune God.